as most things are with artificial intelligence, there's a little bit of a double-edged sword to it. There are ways that companies can maybe better monitor for human capital, labor rights, human rights by employing technology. But on the other side of that, there could be surveillance issues, undue pressure put on the workers in the workplace by having, constant surveillance on them employed by AI.
You're listening to The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. Thank you for joining us. From labor rights to workplace culture, human capital risks are increasingly being recognized as financially material, affecting productivity, reputation, and ultimately, why we're all here, long-term returns. Let's take in Australia, around 1 in 5 employees report workplace sexual harassment in the past year alone, with women disproportionately affected. At the same time, we can talk about the rapid expansion of certain sectors, from EV to data centers, which are also putting labor conditions firmly under the spotlight. For investors, these are not soft issues, but risk factors that should be urgently addressed. To unpack this, I'm joined by Emily DeMasi, Regional Team Lead for North America at EOS at Federated Hermes Limited, and co-lead of its human capital theme. Emily, before we get into the issues, can you tell us about your role at EOS and your work on human capital?
Yes, absolutely. I joined EOS about 6 years ago as a lead engager, a director, really focused on the S of ESG, so all things social, but particularly focused on human capital. 3 years ago, I took over leadership of the team, so really helping to translate the global engagement program that EOS conducts into the context of the North American market. And human capital has always been a passion of mine, but it is a specific high priority theme for our institutional investors. And so it's a real privilege to lead the human capital theme and to look at companies' largest asset, which is really their people.
I know we seem to forget that a company's largest asset is always the people, right? The human capital. But we keep talking about infrastructure and everything else in between. So first, human capital is so broad. Let's focus on workplace culture and later about workplace violence or harassment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in Australia, I didn't know this until I started doing the research, but Australia has some of the highest reported rates globally, with roughly 48% of workers experiencing workplace violence or harassment. But from your perspective, how should investors think about this, not just as a social issue, but, as you pointed out, as a financially material risk?
Yeah, I think when you think of workers as the true asset of a company, it's quite easy to make the financial connectivity on why treating them well, developing them well, providing them with a decent standard of living and benefits is to the long-term advantage of a company. I would say that, being able to measure human capital is probably a bit more difficult than some of the other themes that we engage on. But one thing we really lean into is looking at employee engagement surveys and understanding, what percentage of the working population of a company is participating in those surveys. What are the results? What types of questions are being asked? But more importantly, what does the company do with the results of that employee engagement survey? How are they analyzing it, looking at gaps in those who might be responding or not responding, and really looking at the concerns that their workforce has?
And from there, the engagement survey probably asks a lot of questions. But where would the workplace culture or even the idea about harassment or violence come into the conversation? Is it after the engagement survey, during, or is it outside those conversations?
I think there's really 2 paths where that would come into play. One is through the engagement survey. So there should be questions around health and safety, around feeling or whether or not there is the feeling that you're working in a safe environment. And that would be, sort of the formal survey that's given by a company. Now, employees are not always going to feel open to respond truthfully on those surveys when it comes to those more controversial aspects of harassment or violence. So then we're going to look at what is the whistleblower type situation at the company. Do they have lines that employees can call to report misconduct? Do they have remedy for those calls? Do they have policies about not seeking any retaliation if someone should call in a concern? So those are the two pathways that we'd really want to see companies employing.
And for our listeners who don't quite understand the mechanics of how a fund manager explores human capital, how do you engage with the companies that you are monitoring or watching or investing in?
Well, there's a number of ways. And, I come from the stewardship provider viewpoint of this. So, not a fund manager myself, but definitely trying to get this information back to our institutional investors. And there are a number of things we would look at. So, part of my role as the lead for human capital management theme at EOS is also serving in a leadership role for the Human Capital Management Coalition. Now, that is a multi-stakeholder, but highly involved with institutional investors group that look for 4 foundational metrics that every company should be reporting on. The first one is simply number of employees at a company. You'd be surprised that that's not something easily found by every company. And we also want that to include the number of gig and contract workers. And that's where you really see, some differences in what's reported. Secondly, we want to see turnover. Again, you would think a rather simple number, but voluntary and involuntary turnover numbers tells you a lot about the culture of a workplace and whether or not people want to stay somewhere or are looking to go elsewhere. We also want to see workforce metrics or demographics. We want to understand if there are any constraints on talent. If you see that there's an aging population in a workforce, you are going to wonder about recruitment and refreshment. How do they attract the right talent? And lastly, and probably the most difficult thing we ask for, is the total cost of a workforce. Again, we talk about the workforce as a major asset of a company. So what investment is the company making in its workforce?
I've talked about this before regarding the growth of AI and data centers. So now we're seeing workforce expansion, but also skill shortages and uneven labor conditions. So how should investors connect labor rights to these structural shifts?
Well, there's certainly an impact that AI is having on the workforce. And we're engaging with companies to try to better understand what that net impact is. So right now, the level of conversation with companies has really been focused on the efficiencies that are being gained by employing AI and some digitization. They're also talking about it in terms of giving their employees a superpower, if you will. But we're hearing this from companies at the same time as seeing headlines around how many jobs might be lost or displaced because of AI and digitization. So some part of the story is not necessarily measuring up. So we definitely want to hear from companies about how AI is impacting the workforce and evolving the workforce. From a recruitment strategy, I'm sure that there is a different requirement about one's ability to employ AI than when, 5 years ago when people were looking for jobs. Also, it goes back to that employee engagement lens. Companies should really be asking their employees, are you using AI? How are you using it? Do you have enough training? Do you fear that you can train yourself out of a position? Do you have any concerns about using AI? So that's a way to get a pulse on what's actually happening with the evolving workforce right now.
And what are your observations around this? Are companies seeing this as a matter of urgency to really look at the impact of AI? Or are we still kind of just trying to figure it out?
But it's a good question. And I find that there is a pretty wide response from companies on their ability to talk about the impact of AI. As I said, most of them put it in a very positive light. But I think some of that is also that it is evolving so quickly that no company is ready to really put a stake in the ground and say, this is
Yeah.
how it's going to impact our company. But we have those that have very robust disclosure about how employees are using AI, how they're being trained. Some places that even talk about their digital employees, while there are others that have talked about implementing AI. And when we offer that they should be really plugging into their employees through surveys to ask how they're using it and ease of use, they find that to be a bit of a novel idea, take it on as, a good piece of advice, and hopefully we'll be incorporating that into future surveys.
I'm sure a lot of people are concerned about training AI so that they lose their jobs, right? And that is part of human capital and the anxiety that a lot of people feel about how AI will impact their jobs. EOS produces an annual review, I believe, and you've come out with your 2025 review. In that report, there were a couple of case studies that showed something that is happening right now with a fast growing company, separately, an initiative that worked for you. So, can you just give us examples of companies or businesses and their human capital strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we're finding as globalization proliferates and companies try to grow very quickly globally is that sometimes that can introduce some risk to the company that they might not have been prepared for. So, an engaging global electric vehicle company who was looking to build production abroad, so in a new country where they had not necessarily had a facility to begin with, we were made aware of some controversy around human rights and labor rights. And what was happening is that about 100 workers were working in conditions that one would really question sort of the conditions that they were working in, how they were getting paid, and if they were getting looked after. And so this amounted in legal action being taken towards the company. It also slowed down the project and eventually really did hit the value of the company. Now, in reaction to this, we were engaging with the company along the way and talked about sort of mechanisms that can be put in at the governance level to really address some of these situations. And in a reactive way, the company did actually put a committee in place to be able to better evaluate and have due diligence over labor rights in new markets. They repatriated some of the employees that were there under maybe false pretense or not being legally able to work in the area where they were. And all of this was good steps and good remedy. But we'd like to see some of that in place prior to these controversies coming up, because really it's not just a compliance issue. These worker and human rights are really risk management and financial issues for a company.
So that's one example. What about where a company implemented the best practice, for example? Can you give us an example of a company?
So if we look sort of on the other end of a spectrum, so not sort of a reaction to a controversy, but really being proactive and thinking, okay, we are a sportswear manufacturer. We have customers that want us to maintain a certain brand. And so if we're going to be growing, we want to do it in a way that's very responsible and transparent and has the right governance and structure. So this company in particular was having some issues as far as their ratings from third parties. As stewardship professionals, we do look to third-party research to help inform the type of issues that we'll be engaging a company on. And this one was actually rated quite low in the governance of its human capital and workforce. But through engagement, actually an engagement over 4 years' time, engagers in our group raised the issue of the oversight and governance of human capital with the company, and actually was one of the first investors that pointed to the supply chain risk at the company to not only its reputation with its customers, but also eventually a potential financial impact to the company for not managing it. So prior to any controversy happening, the company put in a very robust due diligence process for its tier one suppliers. Now, 100% of its tier one suppliers are looked at for different human and labor rights flags, and they have very good diligence over that. They also have a sustainability committee in place that oversees sort of the human capital aspect of what the company is doing and the human rights risks that might be in the supply chain. And, our job is never done. We think that having those things in place have really prevented some of potential controversy as the company continues to grow and its supply chain gets longer. But now we're actually engaging with the company on its tier two suppliers. So really wanting them to take that good practice that they put into place and expand it into its supply chain.
So with that in mind, do you think companies are going to get better at managing labor risks on their own, or does engagement make a big difference?
I think engagement is crucial here. I would like to think that companies do good things out of self-interest, but the truth of the matter is there is so much for them to be managing at any one time. And when we think about the geopolitical environment that companies find themselves in right now, I think it's really easy to get distracted from some of those core financial risks, but that seem business as usual. And your workforce is a BAU situation with the company. So I really do think it is part of proper stewardship to make sure that companies are looking at this as a material risk. And, regulation is changing. There are some regions where this is regulated. And so you don't need institutional investors or the investor community really, bringing this up for companies because it's part of the framework. But that's not true in all cases. It's certainly not true as you get further down the supply chain into global markets where they might not have the same regulatory requirements.
And finally, looking ahead, this is all very promising as well, even if I know that this is just the tip of the iceberg on the topic. But what areas of human capital risk are you focusing on in your current engagement work?
Well, one thing that we're focusing on, and I've brought it up before, is the impact of AI. Because as most things are with artificial intelligence, there's a little bit of a double-edged sword to it. There are ways that companies can maybe better monitor for human capital, labor rights, human rights by employing technology. But on the other side of that, there could be surveillance issues, undue pressure put on the workers in the workplace by having, constant surveillance on them employed by AI. So this sort of impact of AI, how it will be used and how workers will be impacted by that is going to be a large focus for us going forward.
I'm super glad that you're looking into this because I feel like everyone's still trying to process what is AI, how do you use AI without looking at the long-term impact on the workforce. We've talked about workplace culture, we've talked about AI. Where do you think investors should be paying much closer attention over the next few years?
I really think that it should be kind of coming back to basics on governance. So the G of sustainability, because really without the oversight of these different financially material issues, it doesn't quite matter what policies or process are in place. It's really about being able to oversee the strategy, ask for and evaluate KPIs that tell you how things are going, that enables a company to think about future-proofing their workforce and think about how AI might evolve their workforce. And if you don't have that at the very top level of a company, then the risk of mismanaging that issue is quite high.
Well, you've heard it here first. We need to really link the S and the G. But overall, I do feel that the market is catching up, and I'm looking forward to the next generation of leaders who are probably more acutely aware of the impact of AI on people, just in general. Once again, Emily, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm Michelle Baltazar from FS Sustainability. Thank you for listening to The Greener Way.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.